Hello, this is Laurie Norton again, and I am doing a summary this week of Johnston's Radical Behaviorism, Chapter 6. The chapter starts off where we see Bridget, a scenario of Bridget. She's been working with Alan for 2 years, and Alan's made tremendous progress. She's developed plans, and he's making progress very rapidly. His social skills are developing, and his communication skills have greatly improved. As a matter of fact, his communication skills have improved so much that he's really able to engage in meaningful conversation. And Bridget feels like he's ready to go on and to develop his ability to solve problems into reason. The problem is how and what do you do to teach someone to improve their ability to reason about events in their life and circumstances in their life? And how do you teach them to solve problems? So we look at Johnston's chapter 6 in the radical behaviorism, and we look at what he has said about it. So reasoning is really nothing more than our ability to think things through. We consider evidence, we draw conclusions. But if we break it all down, reasoning is no different than any other verbal behavior. It involves all the same response classes as introduced by Skinner in his book, Verbal Behavior. So we have to break it down. Reasoning, we need to break it down into its components. I'm going to try to do this as simply as possible, but use as much technical terms as I can. The proposition is the core concept of reasoning. A proposition is just something that we know, we believe, we think, we judge, we assume. So if we say the sky is blue, that's stating a proposition. If we say that one political party would be the best for our country at this time, we're stating a proposition. So propositions are really complex forms of what are tacks. Tacks are just verbal responses that are consistently reinforced. The book talks about the word car. If you always say the word car in the presence of car, that's consistently reinforced, and that's a tact. So a proposition is basically just complex forms of tacks that's consistently reinforced. So there are several different ways that propositions become complex. So when propositions are connected with the assertive autoclitic is, they put the relation between two propositions. So is goes between two propositions. When tact relate, they can relate verbally, a verbal behavior to a non-verbal relation or features in the environment. So a tact can relate a verbal behavior to something that's nonverbal in the environment, or it can relate verbal behavior to other verbal behavior. And when it relates verbal behavior to other verbal behavior, that's called an intraverbal. Now, so a speaker's behavior when talking about these tacts and talking about these prepositions is considered effective if if it produces a reinforcing outcome. So a speaker is reinforced. So let's use a prosecuting attorney. That's what's used in the book, a prosecuting attorney, and he wants the jury to believe that the defendant is guilty. So he will use propositions that he feels like would be more effective at having the listeners, the jury, believe what he is saying. So he may use some statements in propositions, such as he may use eyewitness testimony. He may use forensic evidence that has DNA at the scene, that has fingerprints at the scene. He uses these things to build and for something that as propositions as he's stating as true. And if the jury believes these things, like the eyewitness testimony, if they believe this forensic evidence, they're more likely to believe that the defendant is guilty if they believe what he is saying. So he becomes reinforced when the jury believes what he has said. So propositions are really, and it's considered an effective proposition, whether it's true or not. So it's effective if it produces a reinforcing outcome that involves the listener in some way being like believing it or accepting what is said. It's considered effective. And that's whether it's true or not. So whatever I'm stating, whether it's true or not, it would be considered effective if I get my listeners to believe it. And the listener's behavior has, with some reference to the proposition, may be considered effective or ineffective, regardless of the truth of the proposition. If the proposition helps a listener respond effectively, then it's considered true. So if the proposition, we go ahead and we take that jury back, and the proposition that the prosecuting attorney, it helps them respond effectively, it's considered true, whether the proposition that the prosecuting attorney stated was true or not. So having a proposition can be defined as effective in two ways. So when we state a proposition, it can be defined as effective in two ways. One, if the listener acts upon it, like accepts it or believes it. And it's effective for the speaker. If acting on it produces reinforcing outcomes for the listener, then it's also considered effective. In both incidents, whether it's effective for the reinforces the listener, it's effective for the speaker, the proposition does not have to be true to be considered effective. So we learn in life to try to speak and talk and have propositions, state propositions that we believe would increase the listener's likelihood of accepting them. We can see this when we see political debates. The candidates speak in ways that they want us to accept what they're saying as the truth. And it's effective if the listener accepts it. It can be effective for the candidate if he sees his poll numbers going up, then he's considered it's effective for him. It's reinforcing for him because what I'm saying must be getting the response that's needed by the listener. So that's when it's considered effective. So we have to then look at deductive reasoning because that's part of this whole reasoning ability. So we have to look at that. And deductive reasoning is basically making deductive inferences. And this is to specify various arrangements of propositions that correspond to certain conditions. And there's three types of deductive inferences. There's conjunctions. Conjunction relates two propositions with the word and. So it is cold and I am working. So we're going to state both of those as a fact. It's cold and I am working. A disjunction connects two simple propositions with the word are. as in the book uses either my dog is brown, either the dog is brown or it's not mine. So if we have a black dog, we then assume it's not the speaker's dog because the speaker's dog is brown. And that's a disjunction inference. And then there's implications, which connects two simple things by an additional verbal response. Most common form is if and then. So if this happens, then this will happen. If it rains, then my house will flood. So we connect those two things together. We connect those two prepositions together and we state them as a fact, as truth. We have to look at inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is basically reasoning by analogy. And it's the thing that was used in the book was like two couples go to eat at the same restaurant, order off the same menu, and order the same food. Three of them get sick right away. So if three of them get sick right away, what does that mean? Most of us will infer that the fourth person will end up sick because three of the people who ate at the same food, the same restaurant, got sick. So we're going to infer that it was probably something with that food and the fourth person's going to end up sick. So for behavior analysis of reasoning, behavior analysis looks at it from a scientific. It looks at reasoning as nothing more than just another verbal behavior. It takes into consideration that all this reasoning that we do is nothing more than a verbal behavior. So if reasoning in other aspects of our verbal behavior in this chapter that we discussed, although they seem very complex to us, if we acknowledge as behavior analysts that when we can establish that it's just verbal behavior, then we should have methods of studying this verbal behavior as well as scientific literature that provides broad and secure experimental context from which we learn. So as a behavior analysis, we should be able to take this verbal behavior reasoning and break it down and teach it. So there starts my question. I want to go back to Bridget. Since if you were Bridget, what would you do? What would be the first things you would start to teach Alan? How would you start to teach Alan how to reason and how to solve his problems if you were Bridget? Thank you.